An Arab American leader, Bilal Hamoud, met with Antony Blinken. And here's what Antony Blinken said to this Arab American leader.
And so when the topic of statehood got brought up, we had asked for both a free and independent Palestine, a statehood, and a seat at the UN Security Council table. And the response was disappointing because it made the comparison to, well, first and foremost, that a vote for a Palestinian statehood from the US would lead to the defunding of the UN from the US being its primary funder. But then the example brought up was that it would be within the right of the UN to then cut programs like the World Food Program. And so the fact that the comparison was made that the world would have to go hungry just like the Gazans are, and the fact that it's US policy to starve the world if Palestinians have a free state, regardless of if that's the law or not, is indicative of something severely wrong.
So Antony Blinken said, we have to oppose Palestinian statehood or else the World Food Program budget will be cut and people will starve around the world. Like, that's the Secretary of State's assessment that he's making to you guys in this meeting?
The example was given that if the UN had to cut its funding, it would have to cut programs like the World Food Program. And that was the example shared, followed by the explanation that then the world would have to starve as the Gazans are. And so that is not the comparison you make to make an argument for why Palestinians should not have a free state.
What that demonstrates is that, look, the U.S. is clearly willing to kill way more than 40,000 Palestinians to protect their settler colony in the Middle East. And it's quite frightening. I mean, like, the destructive capacity of the U.S. is huge, not just with bombs, but obviously like a lot of the programs that they've forced a lot of the global south to be reliant on to not starve, like the World Food Program, rely a lot on U.S. funding. So if the U.S. were to defund those sorts of things, you would see people die very quickly. So I think it just shows you how serious they are about protecting Israel and really just protecting U.S. empire. At the end of the day, that's all that means. Protecting Israel means protecting the U.S., Israel's extension of the U.S. I actually am curious, Katie, your thoughts. Like, we didn't really talk about this before we're going to go on, but I know you probably saw that woman who resigned from the Biden administration, Lilly Greenberg, who was like, I think that Biden is making Jews the face of American militarism, and I think that's really dangerous. I thought that the way she phrased that was really smart and true.
What I'm the most scared of is that the president is using us as justification for slaughter, that he's making Jews the face of the American war machine. And I want my community to be really clear-eyed and really consider what that means for us, and to see what the rest of the country sees, right? That Jews are being used as justification for this, and that it doesn't make us safe.
You should get on your show, Katie.
Yeah, I'd love to. Lily, if you're watching. And she was like an old school, like she did like a bunch of, I can't remember. She did stuff with Israel, like with the Israeli government. She did like internships or PR or something. You know, she was like a dyed-in-the-wool American Jewish Zionist. Yeah. So this is a bit interesting, a big deal.
I mean, Israel's alienating like the people that it tried so hard to like indoctrinate and sort of like bring into the network of like pro-Israel activism. So that says a lot too about why they're so desperate. Like, no wonder they're so desperate, because they're losing people like that. I'm actually curious, I know it's your show, but I'm curious what you think about that, because like that's actually what's happening. Like, they're literally just like throwing up Jews and being like, we have to basically do genocide and maybe starve the world. And we have to do it for the Jews.
For the sake of the Jews. Yeah, I mean, I've said this a few times. The thing that makes me want to speak out and focus on this issue on my show and in my life are two things. One is I would do it no matter what, because I think Palestinians, you know, are denied basic human rights, etc. I'm not saying anything revolutionary here or original. But also, as a Jew, it's a moral, ethical emergency. Then as a Jew, I'm motivated by two things. One is it's important to show, for the sake of Palestinians, I think, that Jews are in solidarity with Palestinians, because every time a Jew does that, it makes it harder and harder to say that supporting Palestinian rights is anti-Semitic. I mean, some people just say it's self-loathing, whatever, fine. But also for more like selfish reasons, relating back to your question, it is important to show the world out of self-interest that not all Jews are okay with this. I mean, Jews are speaking up against this. Israel tries to conflate being Jewish with being Zionist. And I've said this many times. The irony there is that that's an old anti Semitic trope. It's like the dual loyalty trope, right? Which all these people who defend Israel uh, find hiding behind any statement. You know, they said that about Ilhan Omar. But Israel, the ADL, and APAC are fine actually perpetuating anti Semitism because Zionism is more important to them than defeating anti-Semitism. They actually need anti-Semitism to be able to justify their existence and Israel's existence as a Jewish state. But yeah, I thought it was cool what she said. She said something about how it's so not, it's not a Jewish value to make other people refugees.
Yeah, and you don't want people to think that's a Jewish value. That's the other thing is it's
Right.
like, are you really trying to suggest that these are Jewish values? Because it's like one way to make like a lot of people in the world be like, oh, Jews are the worst. Is if
Yeah, of
you're
course.
like, well, being a Jew means
Right.
doing
Well, I
all the
remember
things the
you.
Israeli government's doing. Like,
Well, you have that story that you told about like drawing. You want to tell that story about drawing a
yeah.
star?
I've told this story, I think, on your show before, but
Yeah.
like, yeah, when I was a kid and I went to Lebanon for the first time that I can remember, I was like 8 years old. I was just drawing shapes with my cousin, like, and I drew a star, and the only way I knew how to draw a star was like two triangles, so it makes like a Star of David, basically, without me knowing I drew a Star of David. And my cousin like freaked out and went and got her mom, and her mom, my aunt, came and was just like, "Oh my god." And I was like, What happened?" And she's like, "That's a really bad symbol. Like, you can't draw that. Like, that's a symbol of like the people who bomb us."
Yeah.
And it's just like, I mean, what more do you need? Like, than a fighter jet or tanks that have like a Star of David, or
Right.
using it as graffiti. Like, my grandmother's house was occupied by Israeli soldiers, my aunt's house, and they like drew a Star of David and like, trashed the place, and that's what they leave behind, so it's like, people in the region, of course they're going to conflate like Jews with that if that's the only Jews
Yeah.
they know.
Right. And if Israel claims to be the Jewish state and to be acting on behalf of the Jews. And yeah, so I
Right.
think that I agree with what Lily said, who just stepped down. And I do think it's an ethical question and a moral question, but also a self-interest question. Luckily, I think it's changing more and more. People are understanding that there are Jews who really reject Zionism, or they're Jews who aren't even necessarily anti-Zionist, but are very critical of Israel. Well, tell us more about what happened to your family whose houses were occupied.
So my family is not from South Lebanon, like, which is what actually like experienced the most brutal of Israel's occupation. But the area my family's from, like, was probably as far, it's not in the north, it's like in the middle of Lebanon, but it's probably like maybe as far north as Israel at these Israeli soldiers went. That was in 1982 when the Israelis invaded
Right.
Lebanon. They like really went like deep in. They took the capital. Like, my family lives about 45 minutes outside the capital in the suburbs of it. And in the other, their village was like, or the houses like in my grandmother's village were occupied by Israeli soldiers. And she went to go check on her house one day. She would always tell this story. She went to go check on the house one day in the middle of the war, because like the Israelis, basically I'm from the mountains, and the Israelis had taken this point in the mountains that was quite strategic, which is where my grandmother's family is from. And so she went to go check on her house, and there was Israeli soldiers in it, and she was pissed, and she yelled at them, and she told them, "How dare you? This is so shameful." And then the interesting part too is like, so my family is Lebanese Druze. Druze, if you don't know, is like a minority sect that basically just, you'll only find them in Syria, Lebanon, and Palestine. And in Palestine, a lot of them got Israeli citizenship, and they serve in like the police forces and in the military. And they're really useful for the Israelis because they obviously speak Arabic. And so one of them started speaking to her in Arabic, and he turned out to be an Israeli Druze soldier. And then she got even angrier, and
Yeah.
she was like, "You traitor!" Like,
Right.
she would always tell this story. And also that, and in a weird way, that kind of speaks to the way that like Israel's creation in the region really sectarianized like a lot of it. It was like the first really sectarian state implanted in the region. So yeah, I mean, that's the story that she would just always tell. And then she yelled at them, and she was like, and they took a shit. Like, I walked in the room, and there's like a star, they had like painted Stars of David. Someone had taken a shit. They love to do that in homes. I don't know why. It's like a way to just like spit on people, I
Right,
guess.
most moral
And
army in the
so
world.
she and my grandmother, may she rest in peace, insisted that she yelled at them so much that she made them clean up after themselves.
Oh, wow, that's great.
And then she like left because what's she gonna do? They have guns.
Right,
But yeah, she would tell that story. So like, yeah, I just, and I mean that's not an unusual story. That's probably the nicest story you'll hear of
right,
interactions with Israeli soldiers. Doesn't usually go that well. Um, and what they did in South Lebanon's horrible. But yeah, there's Lebanese people who have way more horrible stories of like all kinds of torture and you know deaths and all kinds of terror that was inflicted by the Israelis.